The red, on-air light flickered above the booth, casting an eerie glow across the dimly lit radio station. Daniel Graves, the night shift DJ at WZRD 103.3, leaned back in his chair, sipping on his third cup of coffee for the night. It was nearly 2 a.m., the dead hour, when most of the world was asleep, except for the insomniacs, truckers, and late-night loners who tuned in for company. He had been hosting midnight frequencies for almost 5 years now, spinning old vinyl, reading out ghost stories from listeners, and sometimes, if he was in the mood, taking calls from those who needed a voice in the dark. The station was quiet tonight, just the gentle hum of the equipment and the faint hiss of static between songs. His producer, Leah, had gone home hours ago, leaving Daniel alone in the soundproofed room with nothing but his voice and the music. That was Blue Moon's Serenade by the Hollow Pines, Daniel said smoothly into the microphone, his voice deep and rich. Coming up next, we've got an eerie little tale from one of our listeners. But before that, let's open the lines. If you've got a story, spooky, strange, or just plain weird, give me a call. You know the number. He flipped a switch, activating the phone lines, then leaned back, waiting. Usually, it was the same types of calls. People swearing they saw something in the woods, a grandmother who claimed her husband still visited her in her dreams, or the occasional prankster trying to spook him. But tonight was different. The phone rang once, then twice. Daniel pressed the button. You're on midnight frequencies. What's your name? And what's keeping you up tonight? For a second, there was only silence. Then, a faint crackling, like distant radio interference. Hello? Daniel prompted. A voice finally came through, raspy and low. I'm dead. Daniel's fingers hovered over the control board. He was used to prank calls, but something about this voice made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Sounded wrong. Hollow. As if it were coming from somewhere far away, somewhere it shouldn't be. Excuse me, he said, forcing a chuckle. If you're calling from the afterlife, you might have the wrong station. There was another crackle. Then the voice returned. I died. And no one knows. The air in the booth suddenly felt colder. Daniel adjusted his headphones, glancing at the caller ID. He just read unknown. All right, he said, deciding to play along. Why don't you tell me your name, friend? If you're dead, how are we talking right now? A pause. Then, my name is Ezra. Daniel's mind flicked through his mental catalog of urban legends and ghost stories, but nothing clicked. The name didn't ring any bells. Okay, Ezra. Where are you calling from? Another long pause. Then, the voice whispered. From where they left me. A sharp burst of static flooded the line, making Daniel wince. The soundboard flickered, the lights in the booth dimming for a fraction of a second before returning to normal. Daniel shook his head. Must be a bad connection. He cleared his throat. Ezra, you're breaking up. Where did they leave you? The voice, almost pleading now, whispered, the river. Tell them to find me. Please. Then nothing. The line went dead. Daniel stared at the phone, his heart pounding. He had received his fair share of strange calls, but something about this one left an unsettling feeling in his chest. He glanced at the clock. 2:07 a.m. The air in the booth still felt colder than it should. He rubbed his arms and tried to shake it off. It was probably just some insomniac messing with me. Still, his fingers hovered over the control board, debating whether to play the next song or take another call. The phone rang again. Daniel hesitated, then answered. Midnight frequencies, you're on the air. Silence. A single breath. Then the same voice, fainter this time, almost drowned in static. They're listening. A loud burst of interference screeched through Daniel's headphones, making him pull them off with a curse. The soundboard glowed red, flickering as if hit by a power surge. Then darkness. The station lost power. The only sound left was the faint hum of something on the line. Something that hadn't hung up. And then, just before the silence swallowed everything, the voice whispered one last time. They're coming for you next. The radio booth was pitch black. Daniel sat frozen, his headphones still buzzing with the lingering hum of static. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have, like the air itself had thickened, pressing against him. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Then, just as suddenly as the power had gone out, the station flickered back to life. The fluorescent lights overhead sputtered, their cold white glow illuminating the small room. The soundboard beeped as the system rebooted. The red on-air light blinked back on. Daniel exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Power surge. Has to be. Reaching for his coffee, he realized his hands were trembling. He curled his fingers into a fist and took a deep breath. Get it together. He pressed a button on the console, rerouting the broadcast to an automated playlist. Soft, bluesy guitar filled the station, masking the silence that had felt too unnatural a moment ago. Daniel tapped the screen of his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He needed to report the power issue to the station's tech guy, but before he could dial, the phone buzzed in his hand. Unknown caller. Daniel's stomach twisted. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. The last call had been nothing but static and that eerie voice whispering, "They're coming for you next." It was probably some bored listener messing with him, right? The phone buzzed again. Daniel swallowed and pressed answer. "Who is this?" he demanded. Silence. Then the faint sound of water. It was distant, but unmistakable. The slow, rhythmic lapping of waves against a shoreline. "Ezra?" Daniel asked before he could stop himself. A breath. Then the voice returned, barely above a whisper. "They know you heard me." A sharp screech of static followed, loud enough to make Daniel yank the phone away from his ear. When he put it back, the call had ended. Daniel let out a slow breath and ran a hand through his hair. This is ridiculous. Shoving his phone into his pocket, he stood up and stepped out of the booth. The hallway outside was dark, the only light coming from the vending machine at the far end. The station was eerily quiet, even more than usual. Normally, Leah or one of the daytime producers would have left some papers on the break room table, or a leftover cup of coffee would still be sitting by the sink. Tonight, everything felt untouched, as if no one else had been there for a long time. Daniel walked down the hall to the electrical room. If there had been a power surge, he needed to check the breakers. He reached for the door handle. Tap, tap, tap. Daniel froze. The sound was coming from the booth. A slow, deliberate tapping on the glass. He turned back, heart pounding. From where he stood, he could see the dim glow of the soundboard inside the booth. The chair was still turned toward the microphone. The empty microphone. Another tap. Daniel took a step forward. His reflection in the glass door of the booth stared back at him. It was just your own movement. The soundboard cooling down. The wind outside. But then, the chair moved. Just a slight turn, barely noticeable. But it moved. Daniel took a step back. The logical part of his brain screamed that it was nothing. That it had probably just rolled slightly, an old will shifting. Then why did it feel like someone was watching him? His phone buzzed again. Still unknown caller. This time Daniel ignored it. He turned on his heel and marched down the hallway toward the front door. He needed air. A break. Maybe even to just leave for the night. But when he reached the exit, he stopped. Through the glass door leading outside, he could see the parking lot, bathed in the dim glow of a single street lamp. And someone was standing there. A figure, dressed in dark, dripping wet clothing. Their head was tilted slightly to one side, as if studying him. Daniel's breath caught. It's not real. Can't be real. The figure raised a hand, and slowly, deliberately, tapped a single finger against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. Daniel stumbled back. He turned and bolted down the hall, straight into the booth, slamming the door behind him. His chest heaved. His heart felt like it was about to explode. When he dared to look out the window into the parking lot, the figure was gone. Daniel swallowed hard and collapsed into his chair. His hands shook as he pressed a button to turn off the automated playlist. The station filled with silence. He reached for the microphone, his instincts as a DJ kicking in, forcing his voice to stay steady. "This is Midnight Frequencies," he said, his voice low and careful. "If anyone's out there, I need to know. Has anyone heard of Ezra?" A few moments passed. Then, The phone lit up. Caller ID, payphone. Daniel's blood ran cold. There hadn't been a payphone outside the station in years. With a shaky breath, he pressed answer. A long pause. Then, they're already inside. The phone went dead. And behind him, a wet footprint appeared on the floor. Daniel sat frozen in his chair, his breath shallow. His fingers clenched tight around the armrests. The wet footprint behind him gleamed under the dim studio lights. Another appeared, and another. They led toward him in slow, deliberate steps. Yet the air remained still. He couldn't hear anything moving. No breathing, no shifting of weight. Just the oppressive silence that filled the station. His heart pounded as his mind raced through every possible explanation. A leaky ceiling? But it hadn't rained in days. Maybe his exhaustion was playing tricks on him? Maybe, drip, a single drop of water splattered onto his shoulder. Daniel's entire body stiffened. Something was standing right behind him. His skin crawled with the suffocating sensation of being watched. He didn't dare turn around. Every nerve in his body screamed to run, but his limbs refused to move. Then, a slow, deliberate whisper, right next to his ear. You let them hear me. Daniel jerked forward, spinning around so fast that his chair nearly toppled over. His eyes darted across the booth. Nothing. The footprints stopped just behind where he had been sitting. There was no one there. His breath came in ragged gasps as he wiped his sweaty palms against his jeans. He had to get out. Now, grabbing his phone, Daniel bolted out of the booth, nearly slamming into the hallway wall. The station felt different, colder, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. His breath fogged in the air. His gaze flickered to the front door. The figure that had been outside was gone. Daniel forced himself forward, each step shaky. His fingers trembled as he fumbled with his phone, his mind screaming at him to call someone. Anyone. But who? The police? What would he even tell them? He reached the front door and yanked it open. The outside air rushed against his face, crisp and real, grounding him for just a moment. Then his phone rang. Caller ID, payphone. Daniel's grip tightened around the device. This time, he didn't hesitate. He pressed answer and brought it to his ear, his voice sharp. Who are you? What do you want? A long pause. Then, a different voice this time. A woman's. You shouldn't have answered. Static exploded through the speaker, deafening and violent. Daniel recoiled, nearly dropping the phone as the noise surged like a shriek of pure distortion. Then silence. The line went dead. Daniel's pulse thundered as he stared at his screen. His reflection in the darkened phone screen stared back at him, pale and wide-eyed. And then, behind his reflection, a figure, standing directly behind him. Daniel spun around, but nothing. His breath hitched. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get in his car, drive away, never look back. But something inside him resisted. This all started with that first call. The voice claiming to be Ezra. The moment Daniel let him speak over the airwaves, something changed. Something woke up. He had to find out what. Taking a shaky breath, he turned on his heel and strode back into the station. Daniel sat in the booth again, staring at the soundboard. His skin crawled with the memory of the whisper against his ear. You let them hear me. What did that mean? Who were they? He pulled up the station's recording software. Every live broadcast was automatically saved for archival purposes. If something truly strange had happened during Ezra's call, he needed to hear it again. With hesitant fingers, he scrolled through the waveform timeline until he reached the exact moment Ezra spoke. He hit play. First, it was normal. Daniel's own voice, slightly static-laced, asking, "Who is this?" Then Ezra's reply, "I don't have much time." Daniel's skin prickled as he listened. There was something strange beneath the voice. A low, almost inaudible hum, like an underwater echo. He adjusted the audio levels, filtering out the static to isolate the background noise. And that's when he heard it. A second voice. Faint, distorted, layered beneath Ezra's words. It was whispering something. Daniel's fingers trembled as he adjusted the levels again, trying to make the hidden voice clearer. The more he fine-tuned it, the more distinct it became, until suddenly, it was crystal clear. And it was speaking his name. Daniel? You're already marked. Daniel's stomach twisted. His breath came in short gasps as he hit pause and leaned back in his chair, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs. What the hell was this? He needed answers. Ezra, or whatever had been pretending to be Ezra, had said, "They're coming for you next." Who were they? What had he unleashed by answering that call? And why did it feel like something was already inside the station with him? A sudden bang from the hallway made Daniel jump. His head whipped toward the open booth door. The sound had come from the front desk area. Slowly, he stood up. Every instinct screamed at him to leave. But he couldn't. Not yet. He stepped into the hallway, his breath slow and careful. Another noise, this time a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Daniel clenched his fists, forcing himself forward. He reached the front desk and froze. The guest logbook, a dusty old binder that hadn't been touched in years, was open. The pages fluttered slightly, as if someone had just flipped through them. He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his ears. Then he saw it. A new entry, a name written in shaky, wet ink. Ezra Caldwell. And beneath it, a time. 12:03 a.m. Daniel's breath hitched. He turned and looked at the station's clock. The red digital numbers stared back at him. 12:02 a.m. The air in the station shifted. The temperature dropped even further. And then the clock ticked forward. 12:03 a.m. The station lights flickered. Daniel's phone rang. He didn't even need to check the caller ID. He already knew who it was. And this time, he wasn't sure he should answer. The phone vibrated violently in Daniel's hand. The screen glowed with two words that sent a cold shiver through his spine. Payphone calling. His fingers hovered over the screen. His instincts screamed at him to let it ring, to walk away, to never pick up. But something else, something deeper, more dangerous, urged him forward. He had come too far. If he ignored the call now, would it stop? Or would the voice find another way to reach him? He exhaled sharply, his pulse hammering. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he swiped answer. Static. Not the usual quiet hiss of an empty line, but a thick, pulsing static, like something was trying to claw its way through the connection. Then, a voice. No, voices. Layered. Muted. Whispering. You heard us. Daniel swallowed hard. Who is this? A pause. Then, you let him speak. Ezra. They were talking about Ezra. Daniel gripped the phone tighter. Who are you? His voice came out steadier than he felt. The whispers hissed in unison. We are the unheard. Then something changed in the static. The frequency shifted. The sound became less like static and more like breathing, wet, shallow, right against his ear. Daniel yanked the phone away from his face. His breathing was ragged, his pulse a deafening drumbeat in his ears. Then, just before the call cut out, a final whisper, chilling and clear. He is not the only one. The line went dead. Daniel's grip slackened, and the phone slipped from his fingers, hitting the desk with a soft thud. His entire body was trembling. His eyes darted back to the guest log. The ink under Ezra's name was still wet. Daniel took a slow step back. This wasn't just paranormal. It was personal. Someone or something had marked him. Daniel knew he couldn't just ignore this. He needed answers. First, Ezra. If Ezra was dead, like the first call had claimed, why was he still calling? And if he wasn't dead, why was his name appearing in a book that hadn't been touched in years? He needed to start somewhere. Pulling himself together, Daniel grabbed his laptop and searched for Ezra Caldwell. It didn't take long to find something. An old article from nearly a decade ago. Local radio DJ missing. Last heard on air before disappearance. Daniel's stomach twisted as he read. Ezra had worked at this very station. Late-night host. Just like him. One night, he had answered a call on air from an unknown number. And then, he vanished. Gone without a trace. No sign of struggle. No forced entry. Just gone. His final broadcast. A chilling, garbled message that no one could explain. Daniel's pulse quickened. This wasn't a coincidence. Had Ezra been trying to warn him? And if so, was Daniel next? A sudden noise made him jerk. A knock at the front door. Daniel turned sharply, his breath catching. Through the glass, a figure stood in the shadows. Tall, still, watching. His heartbeat thundered as he approached, each step slow and cautious. The figure didn't move. As Daniel reached the door, his fingers hovered over the lock. Then, his phone buzzed. His gaze flickered down. Payphone calling. His breath hitched. He looked back up. The figure was gone. Vanished. The outside was empty. Only the dim streetlights cast long, eerie shadows across the pavement. Daniel hesitated, then backed away from the door. He didn't answer the call this time. Instead, he locked the station door and made a decision. He needed to find out what happened to Ezra, because whatever had taken him was coming for Daniel next. Daniel sat in the dim glow of his studio, staring at his computer screen. The article about Ezra Caldwell still burned in his mind. A radio DJ who vanished without a trace, right after taking a mysterious call, just like the ones Daniel had been receiving. Ezra had worked here in this very station, in this very chair. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. This wasn't just a ghost story. It was a pattern. And if Ezra had been the last piece of it, then Daniel was next. His phone still buzzed on the desk. Payphone calling. He ignored it. He needed to act fast. Find out who Ezra was. Find out what happened to him. His fingers flew across the keyboard, searching deeper. After an hour of digging, Daniel found something chilling. A transcript of Ezra's final broadcast. The show had aired exactly 10 years ago, almost to the day. The transcript started normal enough. Ezra chatting with late-night listeners, making jokes. Then, caller had come on. Unknown number. The voice had been distorted, described as both far away and right next to the mic at the same time. Caller, you hear us? Ezra, sorry? You're a little staticky there, friend. Caller, you let him speak. Then the static swallowed the call. The signal cut in and out. Listeners later reported that the audio had warped, turning into something inhuman. But the last clear thing Ezra ever said before the transmission ended forever. Who are you? No one ever heard from him again. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his heart hammering. He had asked that same question to the voice on the phone, and now it was coming for him. A sharp knock at the studio door made Daniel jump. He froze. It was too late for visitors. The knock came again. Slow, deliberate. Daniel swallowed hard and rose to his feet. He moved toward the door, every step heavy with dread. Through the glass, a shadowy figure stood just beyond the glow of the streetlights. Tall, motionless, watching. Daniel hesitated. Then his phone vibrated again. He glanced down. Payphone calling. His pulse spiked. When he looked back up, the figure was gone. The street outside was empty. Only the dim neon sign of the radio station flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. The payphone in the distance still glowed, untouched. Daniel clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. And whatever had happened to Ezra was beginning again. Shaken, Daniel did the only thing he could think of. He pulled up the station's archives. If Ezra had spoken to something unnatural, maybe the original audio recording of that night still existed. Took nearly an hour, but he found it. Buried deep in old, forgotten files. Ezra Caldwell, final show recording. The file was corrupted, distorted beyond belief. But Daniel hit play anyway. At first it was just static. Then a voice. A whisper. Who are you? Daniel's breath caught. Ezra's voice. The last words he ever spoke. Then a second voice. But this time it wasn't the distorted whisper from the transcript. It was clearer, cold, hollow, and speaking directly to Daniel. He is not the only one. Daniel slammed the laptop shut, his heart pounding. The radio station went silent. Even the usual hum of electronics seemed to vanish. Then, the door to the recording booth creaked open. Daniel turned slowly. There was no one there, just the dark, yawning space beyond. A shadow moved inside. Something was waiting for him. Daniel sat behind the wheel of his car, staring at the radio tower rising through the mist. The red light at its peak blinked rhythmically, like a warning, or a heartbeat. The abandoned broadcast station beneath it loomed in the darkness, silent, waiting. The radio in his car crackled to life. Static. Then a voice. "You made it." Daniel froze. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't a mistake. It was someone or something inside the signal itself. His grip on the wheel tightened. He should drive away, leave this place behind. But the pull was too strong. This was where it began. And he knew deep down this was where it would end. The air inside the abandoned station was thick with dust, the faint scent of mildew clinging to the walls. Old equipment sat untouched, covered in cobwebs. But the power was still on. The signal was still alive. Daniel's eyes were drawn to the recording booth at the end of the hall. The glass window was cracked. A chair was overturned inside. And the microphone, it was on. The red light blinked steadily, as if someone was waiting. His phone buzzed. He didn't want to look, but he did. "Unknown number. Sit down. Speak." A chill crawled down his spine. Daniel's breath was shallow as he stepped into the recording booth. The chair creaked as he sat. The microphone hummed in front of him. He reached out with a shaking hand and pressed the button. "Who are you?" he asked. Silence. Then, "You already know." The voice wasn't coming from the radio. It was inside his head. The lights in the room flickered. And suddenly, Daniel wasn't in the booth anymore. He was somewhere else. The static grew louder, twisting into whispers. Faces flashed before his eyes. A man in a dark coat. A woman crying on the phone. A radio DJ sitting in this very chair, speaking into the void. And then, a name. Ezra Caldwell. Daniel gasped, gripping the table to steady himself. He knew that name, because it was his name. The realization hit like a freight train. He had always been here. He had always been broadcasting. Daniel, Ezra, whatever his name truly was, had been trapped inside the signal for years. Lost in the frequency. Repeating the same transmission over and over, forgetting each time. Until now. Until the signal was strong enough to let him remember. The microphone in front of him crackled. The voice whispered again. "Finish the broadcast, Ezra. Let them hear." The equipment around him whined, the dials spinning wildly, the speakers vibrating with an unseen force. The signal was building. Ezra reached for the transmission switch. His hand trembled. Outside, the red warning light atop the tower blinked faster. The signal was waiting for him. For the final transmission. For the last broadcast. Ezra took a deep breath. And then, he spoke. The screen on the console flickered. The recording timer reached 0. And then, silence. No static. No voices. No sound at all. Just dead air. The radio station went dark. The tower's red light faded. The signal was gone. And so was Ezra Caldwell.